Hi, it's Rob from the Bush and Boltgun. Today's tutorial is going to be part 2 of Horus and Sanguinius on board the Vengeful Spirit. If you'd like to support the channel, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Now on to the video. So the first colour we're using today is going to be Citadel Dryad Bark. What we're going to use this for is painting on some of the details onto Sanguinius' armour, because we're going to be working on Sanguinius today. So what I tend to do is I will use this colour to darken down the areas which are going to be have lots of shade in them. So he's got like this vented piece at the top here. So doing the rough shapes of that, because then we can add the golden thin stripe later. So I'm going to get those rough outlines and shapes done. So I'm going to do a big shaded bit here, kind of like by the armpit. He seems to have some sort of scale mail, golden scale mail on that part of him. He's also got some darker bits around the chest armour too. Some little details like another little vented area around the neck piece. So we're going to use a little bit of Retributor armour now. We're going to start adding in the proper shape to this armour. So he's got kind of like a pointed section on this armour piece here, the pauldron, where he's got, I presume, a similar vented piece to the other arm, but facing the opposite way. We are just going to start adding little spots of Retributor armour to this area. And this is so that we can put those little scales in place. Just going to use the tip of the brush to do this, and then because there are several different shades of gold, we'll be using shades to calm them down and smooth them over and get them looking a bit more like they do in the picture. Also keep coming back to the Dryad bark. You will notice me swapping and changing paints on this bit quite a lot. That tends to be because I'll be reshaping something or adding a little bit somewhere just to make it the right shape or to add a specific detail to it. So like the inside of this pauldron here, where you've got that curve and the dark bit around the scale mail, there's actually a thin line that goes around the outside of that, which I will add on shortly. And that is because once you've got the basic shapes of everything, you can then start adding the detail to it. So I'll be using Dryad bark just to put in a few little bits there. Use a little bit of Mephiston Red just to move that Eye of Horus further into the middle, and we're just going to use a little bit of Caliban Green to do the laurel around the outside of that. Maybe a few slight jumps in this where it moves to one bit, or from one bit to another bit. That's because I try to keep it as fluid as possible, so it's going start to finish rather than having the cutaways and cutbacks. So we're using Reikland Fleshshade here. This will give a nice kind of warm redness to the golden armour. And it's once you start adding the shades that you can start getting that shape and the sort of 3D effect going, because you will have the darker shades and the lighter shades of gold. And all I'm doing here is, if you're looking at the picture of Horus and the Emperor, I'm trying to add this shade and then the Agraz shade here in the areas where it is the darkest. Now annoyingly this part is slightly off. I have to keep my eyes on the shoulder pad when I'm painting it, so I'm kind of not really looking at the camera too much when I'm doing it, which is not ideal. We're using the Agraz shade to do the darker shades, and then the Reikland Fleshshade is being used to do the lighter shades. So we shade it first before we're putting all the detail onto it, and that is because the shades tend to carry across all the details, and then the details will be shining on top of the shaded areas. So they'll be like ridges catching the light and what have you. So a little bit more Reikland Fleshshade now. We're just going to shade a little bit around the Eye of Horus. As with all things, when you're shading it, you will probably have to go back and keep applying a couple of layers of shades, but you have to make sure that each layer is dry before you apply the next one, otherwise it does leave some pretty awful tide marks. So now we're putting in these verticals first part on the right hand side there is completely off camera, so I've put this part a little bit better for the second half, and we're doing those almost vertical lines. On the right they slope one way and on the left they slope the other, so it's worth looking at them and seeing how they stand when you're doing them. Now I'm starting to add the Retributor armour to the areas that are brightest on the actual image. So if you look on the picture, the top and the top left of the pauldron are catching the most light, so we're reapplying Retributor armour to these areas to make them stand out, and then we'll be highlighting them like gold as usual. So one thing that's not shown here, because there isn't really anything to show for it, is I use a little bit of Citadel Cadian Fleshtone to put his skin on, and you can only see a little tiny bit of that underneath this silvery bit that we're working around now. Also a little bit of Averland Sunset for his hair. As I say, you can't really see that either, because that is obscured by that. There's just a thin sliver of that colour around the silver decoration on the shoulder pad. So I really covered that because there's nothing really to do with it. All I do is put that on and then use a little bit of Reikland Fleshshade on the skin and a little bit of Fuegan orange you see here going onto the hair. I put this bit in so you can just see what I mean. You can't really tell anything's there because it's just a thin sliver. So now I'm going to highlight the gold using Citadel Liberator gold. This is exactly the same as how I usually do gold on miniatures, and you're using this to pick out the areas that are highlighted in the original picture. So you've got like outlines and ridges on the armour and that kind of thing, and it's those areas that you want to be highlighting. So we've now added a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome to the Liberator Gold, and we're just touching up these bits and picking out some of the details so they really stand out. I do apologise for this being at the bottom of the screen for a lot of this. It's quite frustrating to see, but I'm sure you can tell what's going on. So now we're going to just add a little tiny touch of Cadian Fleshtone back to it. As I say, you can't really see much, you can't really do much with that, so we're just putting a few little spots to give that a bit of colour where we put the Reikland Fleshshade. Then we're going to do the same with the Averland Sunset. As I say, this wasn't covered earlier in the video, so if you are just doing it now, all you're doing is a bit of Averland Sunset, Fuegan Orange, then a little spot of Averland Sunset again. And then we're doing Cadian Fleshtone, Reikland Fleshshade and Cadian Fleshtone once again. Now I'm going to use some Zandri dust. I'm going to completely cover this area. I think we used Talan sand initially. I was looking at the colours of it, I reckon this would be a better colour to use for it. And all we're going to do is we're going to increasingly add more and more white to the Zandri dust. And we're going to start highlighting this. Now it's not going to be nice smooth strokes, you're going to be doing this quite rough and ready, because that'll give you the mottled effect because it's meant to be fair. So adding a little bit more Vallejo White to it. And on this section I think Vallejo White is probably added 2 or 3 times. Each time it comes back and you see it getting slightly lighter, because we're just building up those highlight layers and getting the highlights and the shades where they need to be. Now a little spot of Vallejo White, and we're going to do the crescent of feathers, which is just upright of the halo once we've added this bit on. And again, this is just being a little bit rough when you're putting it on, it doesn't need to be smooth. because you want to have those tufty little bits of feathers sticking out. Next we're going to use a little bit of Dryad bark and do the inside of the wings, so you can see part of that around the halo on the underside here and on the inside of the halo too. Adding a little tiny spot of Vallejo White to the Dryad bark. We're just going to mottle that, so you've got a few little lighter areas underneath the shaded bit. Now Mephiston Red, we're going to start working on the two Blood Angel symbols here. So you have nice round red. We're going to use some Evil Sunz Scarlet on the bottom left of it, like you would do if you're painting maybe gemstones or lenses, that kind of thing. But we are using it bottom left on the right hand one and bottom right on the other, because that's where the light is coming from. Now I'm just going to use a touch of Squig orange from Citadel to highlight those parts too. I'm going to use a tiny spot of Vallejo Black to paint in a blood drop on there. You dive like a chameleon to do this sometimes, to keep one eye on the camera and one eye on what I'm painting. Now going for a little bit of Caliban green and a little bit of white mixed in, just to lighten those. And we're just going to put in some little leaf shapes and jut out with the leaves, so you've got that rough edge around there like you just done with the feathers, and that'll just make it look like you'd have the leaves on there. Now once again we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black. I'm going to use this to do the spots on the fur. Now there is specific places you can put these. I just did them random spots dotted about. Like so. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Mephiston Red and mix in a little bit of white with that. I'm just going to do some little highlights on the top right hand side, almost like a thin line crescent. Add a little bit more white and highlight that once more, like so. And then finally we're going to put a spot of white at the left hand end of both. That is just a little bit of light catching them. And that is where we're leaving it this time. We've got Sanguinius finished at the bottom, ready for the next layers next time we come back. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel and you enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Thanks very much.